Elon Musk. Elon Musk was and is the richest person in history. He has recently become by far the wealthiest person in the world at a time when the world is thousands of times wealthier than it has ever been. He has an enormous slice of an enormous pie that really can't be matched by any historical figure. Now, alright, I can already hear the angry keyboards clicking away. What about Rockefeller? What about Mansa Musa? The Rothschilds? Augustus? That dude who Citibank transferred $81 trillion to last week? Well, what about them? If you use the traditional net worth calculations, none of these people really hold a candle to Musk. He alone has more wealth than the entire global economy did just a few hundred years ago. But maybe this is unfair. At this level, the very definition of wealth becomes a bit abstract. How do you compare someone who can fund his own space program to someone who personally owned Egypt as his private property? No matter how much gold the kings of old could stack up, they could never hope to have access to a lot of the modern amenities that we have today. It gets a bit grey. But unpacking this question is one of the best ways to not only understand what wealth really is, but what it has meant for people throughout history.
It's going, baby. It's going.
The crowning jewel, so to speak, of a long lineage of West African imperial rulers.
Decided that he was going to do everything he could to crush any sort of opposition in Russia.
No one in the world today, anywhere in any other country, is more powerful than President Xi Jinping.
The two most common methods for comparing wealth throughout the ages is adjusting for inflation and comparing someone's net worth to GDP at the time. But over these timeframes and at these levels of wealth, simple calculations like this have some problems. Inflation, normally measured using a consumer price index, is great for measuring the changes in the cost of living, but doesn't take in consideration how patterns fluctuate over time. $1 million back in 1920, at the height of Rockefeller's fortune, certainly bought a lot more real estate, food, fine jewelry, and hired servants than it would today. But all the wealth in his world wouldn't be able to buy a smartphone. And yet more people today have one of those devices than they have running water. Adjusting for inflation even further back becomes even more difficult. We used different currencies and spent our money in radically different ways. Adjusting for GDP ties wealth to economic output, but using inflation can make a historical figure appear more or less wealthy than they actually were in their time. For example, an aristocrat living in 14th century Transylvania would have a standard of living that would be far less enviable than that of a guy flipping burgers to pay for his climate-controlled studio apartment, enjoying streaming subscriptions in a modern city with healthcare, mechanicalized travel, and supermarkets. This raises an interesting question. If your standard of living is higher than most of history's richest people, does that mean you're wealthier than your net worth suggests? Bill Gates, Howard Hughes, and Cornelius Vanderbilt would all appear on a Forbes rich list, but shift the time frame back long enough and you could argue that one of the richest people in history was the caveman who had the most cows. And why not? When we think of rich people, we imagine kings, emperors, or tech billionaires enjoying things only money can buy. But a GDP model means that when humanity was down to just 7,000 people during our endangered phase, even if all the wealth of this time was split completely evenly, that would make every caveman at the time responsible for about 0.14% of the world's wealth, more than most billionaires today. But nobody's reasonably going to argue that these were some of the richest people in history. If anything, accumulating wealth in the Stone Age was harder. Food spoiled and tools broke, and access to fertile farming land or fresh water was never guaranteed. If you think you've experienced a volatile market, imagine what it was like losing the little you had when the Ice Age hit. Yes, it's an absurd example that pushes this historical adjustment to its extreme, but then where do you draw the line as to when this becomes viable? Never had so much wealth relied on so few tangible goods, especially tangible goods with an incredibly short lifespan. Yet, in our modern age, we've come to view wealth as intangible. It's in stocks and cryptocurrency, securities and net worth. that can live on long after we've left this mortal plane, which means you can be considered rich without having anything. This is all to say that determining what qualifies someone as rich greatly depends on what economic model they were living in, and what economic model they invented. That's why Mansa Musa was not one of the richest people in history. It's time we all accepted that the 10th king of the Mali Empire is the Dunning-Kruger answer. Nonetheless, it must be said that his reign from 1312 to 1337 was opulent thanks to controlling West Africa's gold mines. Historians estimate that Mansa Musa controlled 50% of the world's gold at the time, which is why some put his inflation-adjusted net worth at $400 billion. He also taxed goods like salt and slaves along the trans-Saharan trade routes. Yet, citing him as the richest person of all time is flawed because his wealth doesn't fully count because of the limited economic development at the time. So that $400 billion? It's speculative. His wealth was tied to a pre-modern economy that was heavily reliant on resource extraction rather than industries or financial systems. In fact, it was so underdeveloped and fragile that he accidentally broke it through his philanthropy. In 1324, he travelled to Mecca with an entourage of 60,000 people, including 12,000 slaves and 100 camels, all transporting gold. He handed out gold throughout his voyage, but he ended up disrupting so much that the inflation in Egypt and other regions skyrocketed. When it was time to return from his pilgrimage, he had to borrow money at high interest rates just to stabilise the very same places that he disrupted. In the end, Mansa Musa's fortune disappeared when he lost control of the gold mines to rival powers of the 16th century, like the Songhai Empire and Moroccan invaders. Not to mention the arrival of explorers from the West following the Trail of Gold. This video is sponsored by StoryWorth, a company that helps you preserve family memories in a beautiful keepsake book. StoryWorth makes it easy to capture the life stories of someone you love, like a parent or grandparent, through simple, thoughtful questions sent to them each week. Over the course of a year, their responses turn into a professionally bound book, complete with their stories and photos, a legacy your family can treasure forever. I got StoryWorth for my mum, and the questions have sparked stories I've never heard before. Memories from her childhood, lessons she's learned, even funny family moments I didn't know about. I get to choose the questions she is sent each week. StoryWorth has hundreds to choose from, like, how did you get to school every day? Or, where were you during the moon landing? But I even wrote a few of my own to capture stories I wanted to make sure she wrote about. It's been an incredible way to connect and learn more about her life. One of my favourite parts? She can either type her answers or record them by phone, so it's super easy for her. And at the end of the year, we'll have a book filled with her stories. A gift that means so much more than anything I could buy in a store. If you want to give your loved ones a chance to share their memories, use the link in the description or scan the QR code here. If you want to have more stable wealth, consider real estate. That's what made Marcus Licinius Crassus a rich, powerful political player. He's often regarded as the wealthiest man in all of Roman history, with estimations of the inflation-adjusted net worth ranging between $20 billion to $220 billion. That's a wide range, so it's easier to comprehend that his fortune was reported to equal an entire year's budget for the Roman Empire. Nowadays, real estate is a common way to accumulate money, but back then, Crassus was a trendsetter. It helped that he was born into a wealthy family, though he did lose much of his inheritance during political purges. When he was exiled, he backed Sulla during Rome's Civil War, which meant the eventual victory put him on the path to rebuilding his fortune. First, he bought confiscated properties from Sulla's enemies at bargain prices. Next, he perfected his fire sale strategy. Whenever someone's home was on fire, he'd send in his private fire brigade, snap up the charred building for a fraction of the cost, and rebuild it. You could say he was history's first house flipper. He trained his slaves into managing his properties for him because he saw how dependable workers are key to sustaining a real estate empire. But he also went one step further. He used his money to finance a little-known politician at the time called Julius Caesar. This was the second successful horse he had backed, which meant that his money was tied up with politics more than ever. Most people would have stopped at this level of security, but Crassus also set the trend for how rich people are never successful enough. He funded his own ill-fated military career when he invaded Parthia in 53 BCE. He should have stuck to putting out fires instead of creating them, because his defeat ended with the Parthians pouring molten gold down his throat to quench his greed. Or at least that's how the legend goes. Perhaps things would have turned out differently if he'd had a chance to learn about real estate from Alan Rufus. He was also known as Alan the Red, but history remembers him for being one of the wealthiest individuals in all of medieval England. When he was alive, he represented 7% of England's GDP, with an inflation-adjusted fortune of $194 billion. It all goes back to the land holdings he was granted by William the Conqueror after the successful Norman conquest in 1066. One such estate was the Honour of Richmond, which became one of the country's most valuable properties. But it would have been nothing if Alan Rufus hadn't learnt how to be a landlord. He was a Breton nobleman and close relative of William, who was key to consolidating Norman control of rebellious regions like Yorkshire. As a reward for his loyalty and military service, he was given vast tracts of confiscated Anglo-Saxon land, including property previously owned by the wife of King Harold. He was even present at the creation of the Domesday Book, with some theorising he had direct input in its creation. This resulted in the implementation of a feudal system, which meant Alan Rufus now had tenants, and those tenants who lived on his land and toiled in his fields had to pay rent, and that rent became a steady revenue stream. So if you've ever wondered who came up with the idea of landlording as passive income, it was Alan Rufus. He used his money to set up religious institutions like St. Mary's Abbey in York, but also to build Richmond Castle to protect himself from assassinations, raids, and angry tenants. Unfortunately, he had no direct heirs, so when he went to landlord heaven in 1093, his estates became fragmented until inheritance laws and political changes directed his wealth into the societal system. If you want your legacy to last, you will need to set up trust funds and private holding companies like John D. Rockefeller. The oil baron became America's first billionaire in 1913, when he amassed a fortune of $900 million, which would be the equivalent of about $340 billion today. At his peak, his wealth was 1.5% of US GDP, which is a higher proportion than the likes of Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. His vast wealth all came from his control of Standard Oil, which he founded in 1817. At its height, it controlled 90% of the US oil production and distribution, but it did not get there on the success of his product alone. The robber baron formed a secret cabal with train companies to screw over his competitors by charging them more for transportation or delaying the deliveries of their barrels. That is quite a sneaky game for a guy who grew up in a strict religious household. Then again, his father was an infamous con artist who liked ripping off his sons to teach them valuable lessons about business. Ironically, he became even richer when the US government broke up his monopoly in 1911. The company was split into 34 smaller entities, including ExxonMobil and Chevron. But by being independent, it helped boost their stock value. As you can expect, Rockefeller had plenty of holdings in these companies, which meant he ended up significantly richer. So even though the frugal man was a renowned philanthropist, he never really lost his fortune despite the Rockefeller name not featuring high up in the Forbes rich list. It has been safeguarded by a web of trusts and companies which the public is not privy to. Introducing the concepts of trusts and centralized control over multiple companies under one name has become a common model for the super rich. That may explain how it's impossible to know for sure exactly how much of his fortune remains. The only thing the public can see is how the oil tycoon set the trend for billionaires to show off their charitable side. Yet his infamy and mystique are nothing compared to the Rothschild dynasty. Historians and conspiracy theorists alike make no bones about how this family is one of the wealthiest and most influential dynasties in modern history. All thanks to a private fortune spread amongst all family members, which was believed to have peaked at around $1.2 trillion. Yet even that is up for debate. The Rothschilds have used private holdings to keep their precise net worth a secret. But the fact that the international banking family has stayed relevant ever since the 1760s speaks volumes about how much money and power they wield. The dynasty was founded by Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who dispatched his 5 sons to establish banking branches in major European cities. This network of international banks allowed them to operate seamlessly across borders. But they grew rich through pioneering financial practices like establishing exchange rates, government bonds, and war financing. For example, Nathan Mayer Rothschild played a critical role in funding Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. This means his funds helped ensure the Duke of Wellington's army had resources to defeat Napoleon. In fact, a hotly contested anecdote has Nathan using early information on Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815 to make a fortune on the London stock market. Thanks to them, banking institutions and international currency exchanges have become a staple feature in our economic system. But their influence goes beyond being nefarious moneylenders. They financed infrastructure like the Suez Canal, which means they've secured some pretty sweet passive income. So even if the fortune has fragmented over the successive generations, their legacy remains a testament to the relationship between commerce and geopolitics. Yet, when it comes to hiding their secret wealth in plain sight, it's fair to say that Augustus Caesar is the champion because he turned ancient Egypt into his personal estate. He may have gone down as Rome's first emperor, but he also blurred the lines between personal wealth and state resources. So even if his wallet was empty, all roads led back to him. Some calculate his net worth was around $4.6 trillion in today's cash. During his time, up to 30% of the world's economic output came from the wealth generated by his vast stretches of land through the Roman Empire. Most of this wealth was tied up in Egypt. Once he annexed it following his successful war against Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 30 BCE, he transformed it into his private estate. Thanks to the area's fertile agricultural land and grain supply, it made up between 25 to 30% of the empire's GDP. Imagine a third of the Roman Empire's net worth coming from your own backyard. Wannabe millionaires often covet Lamborghinis and LA mansions with champagne jacuzzis, but when it comes to flexing, nothing beats having the pyramids of Giza as your garden ornaments. But keeping Egypt for himself wasn't just the spoils of war. It was a strategic powerhouse of a move. First, it expanded the empire's efficient taxation system. Next, it introduced a standardized currency to further economic growth. And with this stabilization at play, including plenty of grain to feed the locals, it quashed any threat of uprising or rebellions from within. After all, by blurring the lines between personal wealth and state resources, anyone who stole from Augustus would have been stealing from their neighbor. Leveraging personal assets in this way reshaped the governance in Rome, which set a precedent for future emperors to meet. He wasn't the only leader to make it big of agriculture. Akbar the Great was one of the Mughal Empire's greatest rulers who governed India during its economic heyday. At its height, around 25% of global GDP was thanks to India's output. Today, that money would be equivalent to $21 trillion. Yet that's not tied to Akbar's personal accumulation, but rather his empire's immense productivity. Land revenues and cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium proved how systematic wealth rooted in land productivity and trade can surpass individual riches. Agrarian reforms were implemented during his reign from 1556 to 1605, allowing for steady income streams. This system was known as zapt and made tax collection both fair and efficient by standardizing how much farmers had to pay by calculating taxes based on crop productivity and market prices. It didn't rely on a flat fee that had been common throughout most of history, so the new system was much closer to the tax brackets in our modern way of life. And with this new income, Akbar reinforced vital infrastructure to strengthen trade routes like the Khyber Pass. He built roads and forts to guarantee safe passage for merchants, which boosted commerce and wealth even further. These moves laid the groundwork for a centralized economy that helped unify India, which goes to show how a country is only as stable as its economy. The irony is that his vast wealth and unification ended up tearing his country apart long after his death. Successors struggled to maintain prosperity, which led to corruption. Add to that some invasions from new foes, and India's dominance rapidly diminished. But it shows how trade can be the key to vast wealth, so long as it can be defended. When it comes to defending trade routes, Genghis Khan is the ultimate security guard. Though some historians would say his inflation-adjusted net worth puts him at around $150 trillion, he was known for having such a small personal fortune that it reintroduces the question of whether a king and his kingdom's wealth are one and the same. Khan was born in 1162 from humble beginnings, but rose to infamy by uniting Mongol tribes under his strong leadership. At its peak, the Mongol Empire spanned over 9.27 million square miles, including parts of modern-day China, Russia, Persia, and Eastern Europe. But whenever plunder was secured from his expansion, Khan didn't fill up his piggy bank. Instead, he redistributed it to his empire, realizing it was better to fund his projects than indulge himself. He lived in portable yurts instead of grand palaces, and preferred to reinforce vital infrastructure such as roads, postal systems, and membership cards for his special protection services. Basically, merchants could secure a golden passport, which granted them safe haven on their trade routes. By flashing this golden passport, merchants could secure food, lodging, and horses on their travels because it was all backed up by the wealth and muscle of Khan's vast empire. On top of that, Khan always made sure to take the best ideas and knowledge from his defeated foes, rather than obliterate them. Think of him like a corporation that bought out competitors to integrate their talents into his network, rather than crush them outright to secure market dominance. This approach streamlined his expansion without tainting his reputation for aggressive negotiation. He was so revered that he was buried in secret. The legend goes that witnesses to the funeral were executed to preserve the location, with some claiming a river was diverted in order to hide his final resting place forever. All this is to say that Khan became one of history's richest people without handling cash himself, or even chasing material possessions. That makes him a pioneer in the way of intangible assets. Yet the best way to hide your empire's wealth is to set up an empire that pretends money isn't that important. Joseph Stalin was another leader whose personal finances can't be separated from his state's capital. Because even if he wasn't that rich on paper, in practice he had final say on how any money was spent in the Soviet Union. Nothing got spent without him signing off on it. As you can imagine, he didn't mind splashing out on himself. His net worth would have been around $7 trillion. That means the Soviet Union was almost 10% of the global GDP at its peak. It comes as no surprise that the bulk of this money came from the seized fortune of the former Russian royal family. Nicholas II of Russia was one of the world's richest monarchs thanks to his $300 billion fortune. It was tied to imperial holdings, including 65 million hectares of land, gold mines, palaces, and jewels. But when the Russian Revolution of 1917 manifested, it was the end of Nicholas's power, fortune, and life. That money was immediately used to fund the communist project, so that when Stalin took over in 1924, there was enough funding to industrialize the Soviet Union. Thanks to collectivization and industrialization policies like the 5-year plan, Stalin transformed the USSR into a powerhouse. This granted Stalin access to all resources while promoting state ownership. Yet, as expected, the champion of equality lived a life of luxury compared to his prisoners. Compared to ordinary Russian citizens. He had internal telephones, swimming pools, private cinema rooms, extensive gardens, vacation homes, and plenty of food and fine wines straight from the late Tsar's cellar. He also had access to special shops that sold imported goods like clothing and gourmet items. Of course, if you asked Stalin or any comrade if the dear leader was rich, they would swear he was beyond a system as evil and futile as capitalism. But seeing as Stalin was the only one who could decide how much of the fortune could be spent, it's fair to say he was at least a billionaire in theory. Then again, for a communist, things only ever work in theory. Now, with all these contenders for richest person in history, it should be clear who outpaces them by quite a margin. That's because a higher share of GDP is worthless if you're from a poorer economic time. And it doesn't matter if you've spent decades paving roads to secure trade routes when you can make more money in a digital space. That's why, despite everything, it's clearly the case that Elon Musk is the richest person who has ever lived. More than likely, he will be the richest person who has ever lived. Unless, of course, he tries to actually get his money that's tied up in his companies. So let's break it down. As of February 2025, Musk's net worth is down to $349 billion, from its peak of $486 billion from December the previous year. That decline is because Tesla shares dropped 27%, which is a sizable enough depreciation to sink most companies. Yet he is still standing, despite 60% of his wealth being tied to Tesla shares and options. This makes his net worth highly volatile and dependent on investor confidence. But does that count when you've bought Twitter and turned it into your own personal advertising app? Never before has a billionaire been able to directly influence investor confidence on such a scale, and with such immediacy. A simple tweet or endorsement from, say, the current president of the United States of America can be enough to recoup a loss, shore up venture capital, or give a newly hatched idea a profitable IPO. When it comes to the world of intangible assets, Musk is operating on a different level. He first got a taste of the relationship between money and the internet when he co-founded PayPal. eBay eventually bought that in 2002 for $1.5 billion, which he then used to fund ventures like Tesla and SpaceX, but also Neuralink. SpaceX's valuations have soared to $350 billion and remains the pioneer in private space exploration. Even Musk's $44 billion acquisition of Twitter in 2022 is unlikely to set him back, despite some initial upsets amongst Twitter users. I mean, ex-users. He's making good headway in turning it into a super app, much like the successful apps in China. And with Starlink having a good chance at beating the Ambani family in the arms race for satellite internet dominance, it's clear that Musk has positioned himself to become a figurehead in the biggest emerging markets. Add to that how he is living in the most prosperous time humanity has ever experienced, and it completely blows away the gods of Silk Road and emperors of the ancient world. This guy can go anywhere he wants in record time, meet anyone he wants easily, and, if using the internet, instantly. He has unfettered access to swaying public opinion about himself and his products, and has ingratiated himself with geopolitics so tightly that he has more lobbying power than any other private citizen in the history of the world. Heck, he has more lobbying power than any elected official. This type of influence, finance, and efficiency are the types of things the likes of Julius Caesar, Joseph Stalin, and Genghis Khan would have killed for. There's just one problem. He can't access his money. If Musk ever did want to cash in on his Tesla stocks so he could stockpile mountains of cash, it would completely disrupt his companies, and in effect lower his own worth. But being the richest person on planet Earth is nothing when it won't be long until he's the richest person on Mars. If you liked this video, check out our one on why China has more billionaires in its government than any other country. And be sure to subscribe to keep learning how history works.